It's ad break time. I'm proud to announce that the Beyond Solitaire podcast is sponsored by Central Michigan University's Center for Learning Through Games and Simulations. At this very moment, Greg Loring Albright's Keep the Faith is crowdfunding on BackerKit. It's a light RPG about the evolution of a new religion, and I'm working on the curriculum guide for it, so you already know I think it's great, so keep an eye out for it. I will also mention that if you want to support this podcast, please visit patreon.com/beyondsolitaire and help me keep the lights on. But for now, let's get on with the show. Hey gamers, this is Liz Davidson from Beyond Solitaire, and this week on the pod, I have a very special guest. This is Dr. Eric Zimmerman. He's an arts professor at NYU Game Center.
Wait, hold on. I'm not actually a doctor.
No, okay, got you. We'll rewind, and we can talk about that
We
because that's
can
awesome.
rewind, or you can keep me correcting you. Yeah, I'm less educated than you might think.
Hey, you know what? You're still an arts professor at NYU Game Center and a game designer, so counts to me. Professor of practice, baby.
Nice.
Okay, so actually, this kind of leads right into some of the stuff I wanted to talk about, which is, you are a game designer, you teach game
Yes.
design,
Right.
but that is not yet an academic traditional like pathway or a professionalized pathway for people going to game design. So, how what does your educational background look like, and then how have you ended up teaching game design
Right.
specifically?
How did I get here?
Yeah.
Well, actually, I studied art as an undergraduate. So when I got a BFA in painting as my undergraduate degree, Bachelor of Fine Art, and I got a Master of Fine Art in Art and Technology. So even though I'm not really a programmer, I'm not really a technical person, it was kind of like a media arts sort of program, sort of interdisciplinary. But it was still fine arts program. So I actually, right after graduate school, I started working in the video game industry. So I got an internship at a company in New York City, and they ended up hiring me. Um, Actually, the story is that I got the internship between my 2 years as a master's student. So that summer, came to New York City, got an internship, and then they wanted to hire me and said, "You don't need to go back to school. You don't need a master's degree. What's that big deal?" But I ended up sort of negotiating that I was hired full time while I was still a student, and I was flying back and forth and doing a lot of my schoolwork remote, and ended up anyway. So it was a very, very busy year, but I hustled that through, um, and I ended up working in the video game industry for. I mean, since then I've been working. I had my own studio for a while that I founded with Peter Lee, called Game Lab. Did a bunch of freelance work, and also always was interested in tabletop games too. So even though it's not been always like my main focus, I've published tabletop games and have a number of tabletop games that I'm working on these days. So um, that's and then in terms of academia, like how I ended up becoming a professor, was that the I had just started working at this company in New York City called RGA, which had an interactive division. They were making games and websites and other interactive things. And I heard that at the ITP program, which is the Interactive Telecommunications Program at NYU, it's kind of like an interactive digital media type of program, but it's not necessarily games focused. Students do all kinds of technology experiments and design experiments there. I heard that somebody that we were working with said, "Oh, they wanted me to teach a game design program, but no, I wouldn't want to do that. I wouldn't." And I was like, suddenly I was like, "Hold on a second. They wanted you to teach a game design program. I want to teach that class." So I ended up teaching that class and dragging along with me Frank Lance, who I was working with at the time, who later became the founding director of the NYU Game Center. But he and I started in like the mid 1990s teaching that class at ITP. And for many years, I was teaching just as an adjunct professor. So for decades, I was just teaching one class a semester. Taught, and then I was teaching at other places like Parsons School of Design, MIT Media Lab, not MIT Comparative Media Studies, School of Visual Arts, these different kind of programs and things, and a lot of it at NYU as well. So I've just been teaching for a long time. Then eventually, after Game Lab closed down, and I was doing freelance game design work, I made the switch over to becoming a full time professor right around the time that they were starting the NYU Game Center. So that rather than just teaching a class here and there, it became a whole full fledged department. Um, and now we are in the School of Fine Arts. So we're in Tisch School of the Arts at NYU. And that means that our orientation is that games are a form of culture. So we see games as shoulder to shoulder with like film and dance and other forms of kind of cultural creative expression. So rather than like we don't have a technology focus, we don't have a business focus, or even like a games and learning focus, we try and get our students to think about who they are as designers and artists and what they want to say and what they want to express through games as their cultural medium. Um, so that's, yeah, I don't know. I think I'm answering your question in a very long-winded way, but that's kind of like the, the circuitous route that led me there. And meanwhile, I've always been making games. So um, my quote unquote research as a professor is the games that I make. So one of the nice things about Tish is that I don't have to publish peer reviewed white papers. I don't have to bring in research grants. They just want us being active in our field. So my creative practice is whatever I want it to be, including this podcast right now. So, but for me, it's mostly making games.
That's awesome. Yeah, one thing I wanted to ask actually is I'm really I love that you started talking about like the way that you frame games as like
Mm,
cultural interactive objects as a part of the arts
right.
because one we will return to this, but my friend Dan Thoreau likes to say that games are not art, and I would like an artist opinion on this. But I also want to talk about sort of the professionalization of game design
Mm,
because you just did an arts education and started designing games. Most game designers are just people who start designing games at this particular point in like the field's development.
mm,
I'm just a post-doc person. I was a high school teacher, and then I became a game designer just because that was what I was doing in my spare time. I
right.
wouldn't even know how to tell people how to design a game. So, what kind of trends do you see, I guess, within the ed world, in terms of game design becoming something that is taught. I mean, is it spreading? Is it just a few places? And then also, how are people framing that?
Right. I mean, that's a really big question. I think that we can kind of talk about two ways that games are used in like a learning situation, right? On the one hand, there are programs like mine where people are specifically coming to study game design. And then on the other hand, there is people using games in a classroom situation where it's not like a game design class, but it's like we're going to use a game or game design thinking in some way in what we're doing. So I've been sort of part of both of those um, kinds of things. Again, the games I make are not educational games; they're mostly commercial entertainment games. But the I'm also have done a lot of work on educational games, and my main job now at NYU is teaching people game design who want to become game designers. So yeah, I don't know where to start. I guess the you asked me what the biggest trend was. I think the biggest trend is that when I was starting, to teach game design, um, people really turned up their nose at games. So there's this thing that happened to me when I was teaching when I first started teaching at NYU. I remember thinking to myself, you know, why do I feel like the head of this program kind of like isn't super into game design, doesn't see it as this cool, amazing thing, sort of is like somehow brushing off our class. I didn't know exactly why. And then I was walking by the hallway and I saw this poster on the wall. And the poster was from Voyager. Now, at the time in the 1990s, Voyager was like this super trendy CD-ROM company. CD-ROMs were this new storage technology, and but Voyager was doing things with like Brian Eno and Laurie Anderson, and like they were publishing this sort of multimedia titles. Really, really cool. And they had this poster. They had this poster for this contest called New Voices, New Visions. And um, the idea was, oh, let's get new people that want to design for this interactive medium. And the judges of the contest were people like, I mean, Laurie Anderson was there, William Gibson, who like, invented cyberpunk sort of, or I guess not, but like was instrumental in starting that whole genre. Um, um, the author of Mouse, Art Spiegelman, um, that graphic novel that about World War II. I don't know, Terry Gilliam, the director of Brazil, and a Monty Python alumni. Like these were the incredible cultural gatekeepers of the time, right? They were the judges in this contest. So on the poster it said, "Do not enter this contest if you think home shopping, encyclopedias, and video games are the future of the internet." It was like video games was
Oh,
just totally being lumped in with all this crap that was like obviously home shopping, encyclopedias, and video games, like the most boring. Yeah, I guess in their case, video games were like they were kid stuff, they were addictive, they were violent, they were like the junk food of popular culture, right? So why am I going into this detail? Because it hit me. It was like, oh, now I get it. Now I get it why the game design class, like there's this whole universe of people that don't see games as like this obviously this cool, interesting form of culture, but just see it as like this kind of wasteland. Um, and I think the biggest change is that basically that has totally turned around, right? That there was games really have spread throughout the culture. And at this point, for example, if you're talking about like an elementary or junior high school classroom, the teacher is now someone who grew up playing games and doesn't have this bias and doesn't have this idea of like, oh, games, why would I, why would I feed junk food to the kids in the cafeteria? It's like, no, 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 they get it. They realize that games are, you know really engaging, and that they can teach all kinds of social and cognitive and intellectual and creative skills. So for me, that's been like the biggest changes. It's kind of like the general acceptance of games as a cultural form.
yeah. Hearing games talked about the way like hurt my soul a little bit.
Oh, yeah, but that's in the past, baby. So we're
Yes.
doing okay now.
Oh God, thankfully. So the other thing that I've noticed, just in my conversations with academics
Sorry,
so
Liz, I didn't
far.
mean to call you baby. That sounded a little weird,
Oh
but you know
no,
what
we're
I'm
good.
trying
We're
to
good.
say.
We're good. I say it all the time too, and then I wanted the same
I
thing.
don't, I don't. Yeah, that was rhetorical. That was not usually the language I use.
No, no, no.
Okay.
So one thing I have noticed, and in conversations with academics over the last few years, is that video games I feel like are much more mature in terms of their acceptance in the academic community.
Mm,
In terms of both people who are looking at them for something like reception studies, like, oh, let's look at the presentation of the ancient world, but in video games. And then
mm,
also in design, I think because computer science is also sort of like a hot thing to go study. So, you mentioned that board games have not always been at the forefront for you.
mm.
So, how have they kind of crept into your classroom? And what do you see as like their kind of current status in the world of people taking game
Right,
design courses?
right. Well, it's weird. So board games have not always been the focus of my professional career, but they've definitely always been a huge part of my gaming diet as a player. So I grew up playing Dungeons and Dragons starting in fifth grade, um, and grew up just playing and inventing all kinds of board games, just kind of ravenously. So I really grew up as a board game player, board game designer, um, and in my classroom, I'm not a I'm not a programmer. So, and Frank Lance, who I was teaching with, he's also not a programmer. So when we first got this class, we were like, how are we going to teach game design? We're not going to have students making video games. So what can we focus on that's going to teach what we feel are kind of like the basic elements of games, but that are not, going to be about coding and digital production. And basically the class focused on tabletop games, so that we were having them make physical games, social games, card games, board games, as a way of learning about design. And that is still very much part of my practice today. Is that I use we're doing playground style games. We're doing, they're modding board games. They're playing and analyzing tabletop games. Then that's the focus of the class, and that's how I teach design. And so for me, I feel like I'm not really teaching them board game design, although obviously they're going to learn that. What I'm teaching are the sort of fundamental things that for me about being a design student, which is like collaboration and problem solving, how to communicate ideas, how to think in terms of systems, how to prototype, how to design meaningful choices, how to tell stories interactively. So there's sort of like all of these fundamentals of um, making things, and thinking through how do I approach a problem, right? What's the process I'm going to use to get from where I am now, which is I have an idea, to over there where I have a finished something, to turn in. So tabletop games are my method for that.
Oh, that's really, really interesting. Um, and then, you mentioned, you're not necessarily teaching board game design, you're teaching like steps towards, I guess, behaving creatively. Uh,
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I don't want to use, you could say design thinking, but for me, they're design classes. I'm teaching design, and games are the way my main method for teaching design. But we're getting into the craft of games. I mean, don't get me wrong. We're talking about victory conditions. We're talking about balancing game economies. All we're talking about player behavior. What it means to win or lose, cooperation, competition. All of these tabletop stuff, but they're like the occasion and the concepts that we're kind of juggling, to to learn through doing.
so I feel like this kind of leads me to, like, you can teach people about what are victory conditions, how do I make meaningful choices, here are some
Right.
ways I can express myself. But I feel like teaching art of any kind has to be really hard, because
Mm,
you can teach people all the technicals, but that doesn't
right.
mean that they're going to make something that works.
Right.
And so, how do you handle that, like in a classroom situation?
How do I get them to point towards something that's creatively interesting, you mean?
Yeah, and then, what happens if they don't? I mean, I'm assuming that you just grade them on other things. I don't know how that works. Like, you have to assess
Well,
as a teacher too. That's hard.
this is, yeah, it's super interesting question, and I feel like, let me talk about the first part before we could talk about grading, because I think that I'm actually really interested to talk about that. But in terms of the how you get them somewhere interesting, it's all about scaffolding, right? So that's kind of like what teaching is, which is like, how do you give them enough structure so that they know what they're doing, um, and but still enough freedom so that they can kind of find their own way. And I would say that that's what teaching is. That's also what game design is, right? I mean, that's the same thing if you're designing an experience for players. You're like, how do I provide enough structure to sort of guide them so that they're gonna have, um, kind of a focused experience, but they're still going to be able to be clever and creative and express themselves. um, so I for me, figuring out what those constraints are on a project, how do I structure their creativity, is a huge part of it. And I'll just give you a quick example. One of the sort of beginning exercises I do is called "What's Wrong with Roll and Move," and I designed it because so many students end up like, if you're not really like a super literate game player, you think, oh, it's a board game, so I roll some dice and move a piece, and I get to the end, and they end up with this sort of like boring roll and move games, and it's a huge like gravity source, like drawing them towards that design conclusion. So I thought, you know what, maybe I'll just do an exercise where we kind of like try and wash that out of them. So everybody starts and we play roll and move game. So it's like, okay, they play, they roll dice, and I have the rules kind of like on cards. So it's like, here's the setup card, here's the winning conditions card, here's what you do on a turn card. So it's kind of like visual rules for them. And then we discuss, we're like, okay, what is wrong with this? Let's really talk about what's wrong. So you can actually end up with a whole long list of reasons, like what was wrong with that game. Well, the obvious one is that there's no choice. It's just 100% random. It's like Candyland, but with a die. But also, uh, there's things like there's dead time if it's not your turn. And if you fall behind, there's no way to catch up. And, sort of a long list of things that kind of make it a boring game. So then, to improve the game, I pass out new cards. So I've come up with all these cards that have to do with like movement or interaction between pieces, the size and shape of the grid, and every group gets about 10 cards, different categories, and they don't have to use them all. They can just take 2 or 3 of them and try and integrate them into their game. And and when you have like a simple rule like, okay, if you can, rather than going in turn order, the last player always goes next. Or um, if you, to see how far you move, everybody chooses a number on a die secretly and then reveals it. And if your number is unique, you get to move that many. So like little mechanics that will sort of help guide them towards something interesting. And they sort of turn that corner. They turn a corner from like a boring game to like fun street. It's like we're on boring street. This game, like I'm rolling dice, I'm moving stuff. It's not that fun. And suddenly it's like, oh my gosh, like I really care about every turn. Like I'm making interesting choices. And so giving them that experience, but I'm scaffolding. It's like, okay, I'm giving you these cards that sort of help get you there. But at the same time, they're still doing analysis. They're still doing iteration. They're having to try stuff out. They're saying like, okay, that doesn't work. If we change this rule, we have to change some other rules. What other rules do we need to change? They're still thinking in terms of systems, and they're playtesting, their own games. Then there's a later thing, which is like they theme it. They figure out what is the theme that's good for this, and that's a whole nother thing. So I guess I'm explaining this exercise just to say that you know sort of like very carefully designed exercises. Now that's like an in class, like let's do this for the next hour or two exercise. There's also like you're going to be doing stuff at home over a couple of weeks and really iterating um, and and modifying the game. Often that starts with like if we're working on narrative games, they might be assigned a game that they have to play and analyze, and then they might be given like a piece of narrative content, like a short story, Octavia Butler's short story or something like that, and then they have to think about, okay, how do I translate this into a game, and they might even be given a genre or format. Like you're doing a cooperative um, simulation, right? Or you're doing an interactive book as your format, or you're doing a puzzle escape room on a tabletop kind of experience. So that they're not having to invent the whole thing from scratch. And the key game that they played and analyzed is tied to that format. So again, just trying to like guide and structure their way through the experience. Um, and usually it works out okay. But the other thing that you asked about, Liz, is like, well, what happens if it doesn't work? That's okay too. It's like, um, you, it's okay uh, if they, if they fail, quote unquote fail, right? So that kind of leads to the second part of your question about grading. Um, there's a there's a professor at here at the Game Center, Alexander King, game designer, and he he started doing these blog posts about grading, and like I've started doing research, and maybe grades actually aren't that great for education, right? So basically he sort of sharing with our community, like, what, actually grades are not um, are not really tied with achievement or academic behavior or even learning, right? That they can actually be detrimental for all of these different reasons. Um, and it's he was proposing, and then he started trying out in his classroom things like ungrading, where students give themselves grades, for example. And it's had a huge impact on my teaching. So basically, a few years ago, I just stopped grading projects. I'm like, you know what? You're making a game. It feels weird to give you a grade. Um, and instead, it's like if you do something, if you fulfill the requirements, if you turned in a game, this was a narrative game, you have a fully playable game with all the rules, even if it's quote unquote good or bad or broken, not broken, innovative, whatever, you'll get full credit for it. You do it, your group did it, that's great. So that's completely, it's completely changed my teaching in a positive way to do that. Um, to not sort of hold over grades over students anymore. I know I don't. Maybe we're straying too far from games, Liz. But
No, I think not at all. I mean, I like talking about education too, and this makes me think of my own time. Like, I'm no longer in the classroom, but we
mm,
switched to standards-based grading and essentially allowed unlimited retakes because that was like the
mm,
amount of flex that I had within like a high school setting
right,
to like
right.
just not grade things in that way. But I also think about, it's very hard. So I taught Latin, but we taught it
Mm.
like a real
Wow,
language as opposed
hardcore.
to like memorizing charts. But we talk about something called the affective filter a lot in the school of Latin teaching that I did, which is where if people feel pressure, if you correct mistakes too often, if they feel too judged, then
Mm.
they will not learn because they're too busy trying to please you and they're not
Right.
busy enough trying to actually learn anything. And I feel like
Totally agree.
perfectionist student me would have freaked out in a class like yours and wanted to take it at the same time. So I guess I was just sort of curious, like, how do you like bring enough relaxation out of your students?
I mean, yeah, that's so that makes perfect sense what you're saying, because when I first started not grading projects, it was like this fog, which was in the classroom, just kind of like cleared away, that I didn't even realize was there, because I had just been teaching with it for years and years. And the fog was students trying to figure out, like, okay, you're saying that it's this, but what do I really need to do to get the A? Like, what's okay, you're saying that I should experiment and this and that, but in the end, like, what's going to get me a better game? Even the ones that were like very independent and creative, they still had that going on in their heads. You can't not, right?
Right.
Especially today, students are very grade conscious. Um, they feel like they're paying all this tuition, so they're basically paying for, the degree with good grades. It's going to get them a job. But as soon as I took that away, all of that fog cleared, and the students were so much more open to experimentation and did such more interesting creative work. And for years I had always said I would rather see an interesting project that's more of like a quote unquote failed experiment than a balanced but boring game, right? Something that works but it's totally safe. Don't do that. But on the other hand, if you're rolling up to the final crit after like 2 or 3 or 4 weeks of work, and you're like, here's our game, oh, by the way, it's a failed experiment, it doesn't quite work, it's sort of broken, it's hard to give that game an A, and it's hard to feel like it's on par with something that is like solid, playable, balanced, but totally generic, right?
Yeah.
Because at least that one you can get all the way through. But as long as then, if I'm not grading it, doesn't matter. So every game gets hard hitting critical feedback. They get it verbally during the critique that we're playtesting it. They get it written feedback, like a you know analysis from the instructor, but they don't get a grade. Um, and it's just like, yeah, I don't know. How was your experience once you removed the? I mean, once you gave them the ability to retake, was that must have changed their relationship to the
It
material?
did. Yeah. So one of the best things about that job was that I was teaching in one of the largest public school voluntary Latin programs in the country. We had over 700 kids in a 3,000 kid school choosing to take Latin, and there were 5 Latin teachers because what we were doing was working in the sense that students wanted to be in the classes. Your more anxious students will, of course, just retake everything until they have 100 because that's who they are. And like the class accommodates that. Even if I'm mildly irritated, okay, fine, you can take it again. But the
Mhm.
other thing was great was that I felt like I brought more out of my students who maybe weren't traditionally excellent students.
Mm,
So Latin actually was also a popular choice for students who were students with IEPs, students with 504s, who were not necessarily being able to be their best in a more traditional classroom, but because they
mm.
had time to figure it out with me
Ah,
and
interesting.
could be assessed on a number of different like types of contributions to the class. Because I was caring about, can you answer a question in Latin? If I ask a question in Latin and they do something, I can get credit for that. You know?
Right,
And
right.
so by kind of changing the way I was assessing to try to hit what I actually wanted to see and also give students multiple chances, I feel like I got more out of more kids and that they got more out of me.
that makes perfect sense to me. And I think for me, it especially makes sense in like an art school. It's like, why would I grade your art project or design project? But even in an academic setting, I think that makes perfect sense. To just change the relationship with the grading system. I mean, we know this from game design, right? It's like we use victory conditions and end conditions as a way of shaping players' experience and their relationship with the whole game. So, how can you shift it in a way so that it's like the victory condition isn't like hanging out somehow outside the system and experience, but it's really helping motivate the kind of core activity, a core experience that you want your players or your students to have.
Yeah. So there's something that you said earlier that does have me thinking though. This is a question I don't know how to ask it because it always feels like a rude question, but I also think it's an important question.
Oh, love
Okay.
rude question.
So and I also have mixed feelings about this. So, okay, I am the queen of having like I've made zero practical choices in my life. I went to
Mm,
college and I studied classics. And then I went and I got a PhD in ancient Christianity and I studied Coptic, and it was amazing. This is not the sort of thing that makes somebody money though. But
wow.
the good things for me, like I was a scholarship student, and when you go into those like PhD programs, like I got paid peanuts, but I got paid. I didn't have to pay them, right? A master's program in fine arts cost money, and I actually remember not
Yeah.
going to NYU when I was admitted as an undergrad because they offered me a scholarship that was just nothing on the tuition
Mm,
at
mm.
NYU. And also, like, I now have this game design job that I am so lucky to have this job. It's like the only reason I left the classroom was because I got like it's like I rolled a critical success and two or three of them in a row, and like now I'm just here, right? But
No,
you know, you
Liz. I'm sure that you got that job because you're awesome, not through some random chance. Uh,
it was years of
but let's
effort
keep going.
combined with some luck. But
Sure.
so I think about this. So you have aspiring game designers, you teach aspiring artists who
Right.
want to work in fields that are extremely iffy at the best of times, and they're paying a lot of tuition. So
Right.
like how
How do I justify that?
how do you justify it?
Yeah,
And how do you make sure they're getting something from you that they can take no matter what happens?
I think that's an excellent question, and it's not rude at all. And I ask myself all the time, and I talk to my students about this all the time too. NYU has perversely high tuition, right? That's a problem with the whole American university system. I mean, I even have friends that teach at like state universities that used to have like fairly inexpensive, especially for in-state tuition. All of their tuition is going up and up and up as well. So, but NYU is, yeah, it's incredibly high tuition. Um, okay, so it often gives me pause to think about like, what am I doing? Why am I contributing to this education system that in many ways is like an engine of inequality? It's like, oh, rich people can afford to go to school, so they get better education, so they get better jobs. People that can't afford to go to school end up getting less education, and it's like, it's like designed to kind of further separate the people, rich people from people that have less means. So yes, I it's a huge problem and challenge. And so I guess I can answer the question in a bunch of different ways because I think about this a lot. One thing I'm thinking about is, well, first of all, NYU. I think even though I really don't necessarily love the administration, one thing that they just started, I think for this coming fall, which is fantastic, is that they've instituted a new policy, which is that if your family makes a less combined income of I think 100,000 or less, I might be getting the exact number wrong, then NYU will cover your tuition 100% for undergraduate. This is for undergraduate, and it is for anyone in the city, outside the city, United States, um, international. Now, it's still expensive to like if you're going to move to New York City and live here, but at least in terms of tuition, I think that that's an amazing thing that NYU is doing. Again, I'm very critical of the NYU administration. I don't want to seem like I'm being a shill for them here, but that one policy I think is fantastic. Um, Another thing I think about is that I we're in a school of the arts. The biggest program in the art school is the acting. program, the theater program. So students come in, they want to be actors, and there's like thousands of them. It seems like in the school, and I know that they're going to graduate and be like waiting tables and tending bar, going to auditions, and a very tiny percentage of them are going to be able to make a living as actors. It's just acting is an incredibly brutal field, right? But I do feel like a couple things with games. So first of all, the game industry, the video game industry, it's in general booming. Now I know there's ups and downs, and right now a lot of companies are laying off people, but in general, compared to film, compared to television, compared to theater, compared to book publishing, compared to whatever cultural format you want to name, games year on year are a growing industry. We're giving them really good job skills. We are also really training them to work in the 21st century. We're giving them technology skills, we're giving them problem solving skills, we're teaching them how to communicate, we're teaching them how to collaborate, how to solve problems, how to work in media, produce content. Our students, actually, many of them work in the game industry, but those that don't find jobs in like publishing or advertising or any kind of media or content or technology field. They're amazing problem solvers. So I do feel like in that sense, even though they're paying a ridiculous amount of money, they're getting a really good degree and really good skills that can translate. Again, I don't want to overemphasize job skills because I think that that's kind of like been the decline of the whole American. There should be more students like you, Liz, that were like, I'm here just to learn and study things and enrich myself, but and kind of study and learn for its own sake. I think that's better. But in terms of trying to justify the tuition, I think what we're teaching is actually really valuable. I keep on trying to think about what are some hacks that we can do. Like I just proposed this to our faculty. Um, what if, for example, this year, if we have an MFA student in our program that can't be admitted because they can't afford to, they just say like, look, I know you're giving me scholarship, it's not enough, I can't afford to be there. What if we propose to them, you know what, we're gonna let you um, we're gonna let you attend all the classes, enter the building, use the resources, but in the end, you won't pay tuition and you won't get a paper degree. But we will vouch for you that you did all the things. So I don't know. There's also some problems with that, but I'm just showing that as an example of like I'm really trying to think about, are there some creative hacks we can do to kind of like help open up our program even more somehow to a public or to students that wouldn't otherwise be able to afford it. So yeah, it sucks. It sucks that money makes the world go round, especially in the United States.
Yeah. No, it's just tough. Like it's expensive even at lower levels now to get an education. But then if you're
Mm,
going for that like highfalutin master's, especially because master's degrees are cash cows for PhD programs.
right.
So I mean, it's a tough road. But I guess the one thing that I would ask then is before we move on to another topic is if you are talking to somebody who's interested in doing a game design program with the interest of becoming a game designer, um, what would you tell them about the intentions and expectations they should come in with to make sure that they're walking the right path for them?
You mean if they're interested in like entering the industry or going to study it?
So if you're planning to get the degree, where should you
Okay.
think that you're going to go with that?
Well, first of all, I would say you don't have to come to school to study game design, right? I think that there's lots of ways to um, become a game designer, to learn about game design, to practice game design. I feel like as long as you're playing games and making games and trying to meet other people that are doing the same thing, you can eventually make your way into the industry. I mean, Liz, I think you're an excellent example of that, right? Without a formal study, I never studied game design. It wasn't a thing one could do, right? So, okay, but I'm not answering your question. Uh, your question was like, what are the expectations that you should bring? Like, what do you mean by expectations? Like, how much
Okay.
time you're going to spend, or
No, I think what you'll get out of it. So, like, for example, when I went into my PhD program, I knew that the academic job market was a hellscape. I knew. Nobody lied to me about that, but I went anyway. And so I thought about it as like, okay, well, I need to have some sort of alternate plan to go through this. And I think I want to be a professor, but if I don't, what am I going to do? And then how will I make sure that I don't feel like the 6 years that I spent in a PhD program was a waste of my time? And like I in fact
Mm.
don't. I in fact think it was amazing for me. It was transformative for me as a person. I learned a lot about writing and thinking and reading, and I would go back and do it again in a heartbeat. But it did not lead to a job. I also
Um,
didn't try, but I think that that's a I don't know, maybe it could've, but still, like, everybody thinks maybe it could, and you roll the dice, and some people just end up miserably trekking from postdoc to postdoc, so
okay, a few things. One is that we actually make thinking about your life after school part of our curriculum. So there's a class that everybody has to take called survival skills, which is like, what are you going to do after school? What can you do with a game degree? That class is like a whole bunch of visiting people that come and talk about their experience of like, some of it is in games, tabletop industry, video game industry. Some of it is people in like game adjacent fields. I went into the kind of like games and learning field. I'm working in the art world, working in marketing, advertising, but doing interactive stuff. Um, I'm working at a non-traditional company like at the New York Times Games division, right? So like people coming in to talk about their experience. And meanwhile, you're working on your resume and portfolio, how you present yourself, how you find jobs and internships. So it's not a class with a lot of homework. It's more like a let's all come and talk about this. Everybody has to take that before they graduate. And we have other things like we have an incubator program. So students can apply for that. They get funding and mentorship for projects. Um, and actually people that aren't even students can also apply to the incubator as well. So if you people teams with a prototype, again tabletop or video game or even something else. um, so we try and ease that transition. We have like a, like incredibly active Slack community. We have email. We have all kinds of discords that are official and unofficial, where students and alumni are getting together. They're posting job opportunities, internship opportunities at their company or other places they know. And at this point, the Game Center has been around for like 10 or more years. So that's another benefit, I think. A lot of our students also want to end up teaching. They want to teach as an adjunct. They want to get on and some of them even get PhDs and want to become full-time academics, which you don't need necessarily to get to teach game design. But I don't know if I'm answering your question, but um, I think the expectation is that you will definitely, like in our program, we try and make it part of what we're talking about and teaching about. I have advisees, like every full-time faculty has like a whole, like I have like 30 different students that I'm advising. And we always talk about, I always ask them about what are you doing this summer? Are you thinking about internships? Like, let's talk about what you're going to do when you graduate. So like it's something to kind of keep them thinking about, again. And I want to find the balance. Your whole life shows, you don't, if you focus too much on um, school as like job training, then you're just going to kind of have a sort of a crappy functional education. Like you're not going to like open up new kind of creative doors in your, in your potential, like in your find new talents and new interests and things like that. But you also want to feel like you're not just like throwing money down a pit, and your time down a pit, that it's valuable and useful. Am I answering your question?
yeah, I think so. Alright, so we talked about kinda teaching game design and, like, going into a program for game design. But you also are, as we mentioned earlier, right? Like you mentioned that you are interested both in teaching game design and in using games as a way to teach things. So you're also co-founder of the Institute of Play, and so it's a nonprofit, and you have opened a public school in New York City with play-based
Mm-hmm.
learning. I want to know all about this. How did you get to this? Like, how did you get somebody to let you over to school? What are you doing? What does it look like?
Right. So when I had a was running Game Lab with Peter Lee, we kind of created a sister company or sibling company, the Institute of Play, a nonprofit. And the whole idea was like, let's investigate the intersection of games and learning. And, our inspirations were things like 862 Valencia, the Dave Eggers company that was like a storefront where kids go in and learn about writing and are publishing books and things. Um, Katie Salen, who was my co-author on Rules of Play, which is a kind of a standard textbook for game design these days. Katie came in and was the director of the Institute of Play for many years, and I was always on the board of it, um, but I was not like full time there. So you're going to sort of get like a slightly, I don't want to say on the outside, but I was never like 100% on the inside because I was doing a lot. I was also running the commercial studio at the time. But what the Institute of Play did was it looked at this question of games and learning, and it wasn't just okay, students are playing games and the game is teaching them something. So it was less about educational games, and it was more about what is game like thinking and how can we translate that to an educational context. So for example, can we have teachers think more like game designers when they're thinking about designing their classroom space or designing a lesson or running a project that students are making? And in truth, it was really a lot of project based learning that the students were doing. So a lot of collaborative work and doing things like maybe narrativizing a project. So it was like, okay, these aliens are coming in to study humans and we have to like communicate with them and we have to like bring things to them and invent things for them. The whole curriculum was a little bit redesigned. So like for example, one of the spaces was called Code Worlds, and they were teaching math and English together as like symbolic languages and things like that. So they were really playing with the curriculum. Um, I think that maybe the most significant thing that they did was that we had gotten a very big grant from the Gates Foundation that paid for game designers to be in residence at the school. So there were two game designers who are basically living at the school, and teachers could just sort of come and collaborate with them and say like, "Hey, I have this unit coming up on whatever U.S. government. Let's talk about how we can make like a government simulation as our next big project." So those game designers were just constantly working with the teachers and making things, and it was a great resource for them. It's obviously not necessarily replicable. Not every school can afford to bring in game designers like that, but it was really cool. So um, the the school did really well. The students loved it. The school still exists in New York City. It's called the Quest to Learn School, um, and they did a lot of consulting and collaboration on designing other schools as well. So they worked on a lot of different curriculum for different schools. A few years ago, the Institute of Play closed its doors. So, like many nonprofits, they lasted for about 10 years. They had a great run, but that nonprofit doesn't exist anymore. So they're no longer directly involved in the Quest to Learn School, which continues. But it's really was an amazing group of people, and they were really well known for um, uh, innovating in this realm of games and learning and games in the classroom and how you teach with games and everything. So it was a wonderful experience. I mean, for example, at the end of each semester, they had what they called a boss level, and whole classrooms would have like a big challenge that they'd have to do together. And I went in as a judge one semester, and it was like a Rube Goldberg machine. So the classes had to do like this giant contraption where they were using all these like scientific principles and things to try and make a big machine. And we went in and they talked about their process and they showed it to us, and then they ran the machines, and we had to give awards and judge them and things like that. So it was really cool. So they were trying to structure the school like a game in a sense, in the sense of like having boss levels and making the day more playful for the students.
Interesting. Oh, that's awesome. So okay. Um, I want to ask. So we talk about game design thinking. It's a way of teaching. It's potentially a job skill. Um, but you're also teaching games within an art context. So,
Yes.
just out of curiosity, do you think the games are art, and why or why not?
Well, I mean, okay, this is like an old, oft debated question. I mean, I mean, really, what the question inside that question is, what is art, right?
Yes.
And so, in the in the in the 21st century, like, even 100 years ago, more than 100 years ago, Marcel Duchamp made Fountain, right? Put it like wrote his name, wrote a fictional name, Armut, on a toilet, put it in a museum, and was like, "This is a ready-made. I want to undermine the whole idea of what art is and what's considered art and how we value art, the cultural kind of machinery that makes art happen." This was like more than 100 years ago that people were questioning these kind of fixed categories. So I find usually inside that question is like somebody's like idea of what art is in their head, right? So, and I feel like, and I don't know if this is the case for you, Liz, but usually people have this idea of like, well, art is this sort of exalted um, cultural category, right, that we aspire to. Um, and I guess I would say, like, I would just want to question the question. It's like, first of all, art is also its own professional practice. Like art, if you're a working artist and trying to make a living at art, it's like not a hobby for you. You're not like going to painting classes and stuff, but you're really trying to do that hustle. Like art is like, it's an industry, it's a job, it's like a whole bunch of institutions. It's like certain people paying money for luxury goods, through galleries, or artists hustling for grants through a system, trying to figure out what are the big buzzwords this year, who do I need to network with, how can I like improve my artist statement to try and get more attention from a certain curator. So like it's its own hustle and industry. And the art world is definitely, it's a thing, right? So in that case, in that sense, um, it's like there's some overlap. There's plenty of artists that use games, or there's lots of game designers that do projects that end up in museums, including myself. Um, but it's kind of like a separate thing. But that's art seen from like an institutional point of view. But I think, from a more like an aesthetics point of view, like can can we consider games as a sort of lofty cultural form? Of course we can. I mean, of course we can. In that sense, it's a silly question. Not that you're asking a silly question. It's an interesting
No,
question, but
no.
but the other thing is like, why is art the aspirational category? Like, why did, again, this goes all the way back to that story I told about, like, do not enter this contest if home shopping and encyclopedias and video games are the future of the internet. It's like, why not make games the aspirational category, right? Like, to me, it's like, you know, in some ways, the art world wishes it had the juice that games does, right? Like games, video games, tabletop games, we are getting our audiences engaged. We are doing things that are like both high art and mass media and pop culture and in education. It's like, why do we have to, why do games have to be like the nerdy sort of wallflower in the cultural pantheon? Wishing that we were more like art. That's the thing I that bothers me most about that question is like let's actually, like, art should be nipping at our heels. Like art should be the one saying like, oh, we wish we were more like games. So anyway, so it's a complicated question. There's
No,
all
I
kinds of
mean,
ways to answer it.
I just love the question because everybody's answer is like so revealing, even though it's a common question. Like, what is a war game? Is a common one in my world as well. But
Ah,
I ask just because I think that there is also sort of within board games, people talk about, okay, well, there is art in board games, you illustrate them, but like, can
oh, sure.
a rules bound interactive activity where the designer may not even be present or have a lot of say about how the game goes still be art?
Yeah, but I guess what I'm there's so many schools of contemporary fine art, like people that are artists, they're shown in museums, they have big exhibitions, they're getting funding that do that, right? Like the whole Fluxus movement in the 1960s, rule-based things, the Situationists, um, and Oulipo, rule-bound procedures for generating behaviors or for literary work. More recently, there's kind of artist social practice, which is kind of like, as an artist, I'm gonna invent a cafe in the lobby of the museum, and that's my installation. And the rules of capitalism are not going to hold here, and I'm going to have my own different economy for how things are going to be paid for. Like that's a whole genre of contemporary art. This idea of like, can rule bound things or procedures that are not directly authored, like that's a very romantic idea of what art is. It's like it has to be the hand of the artist placing it. There's conceptual artists like, you know, um, It's like Saul LeWitt in the 1960s was doing things that are like, you know what, museum, here's the artwork. The artwork is a set of rules, and the rules are like, draw draw 10,000 lines, each at a slightly different angle within a square, 12 by 12 feet, and like follow those rules, and then that's the artwork. And so every time um, a gallery shows this thing, they have to redo it, and it's a procedure, it's an algorithm, and it's totally process based art, and it's just basically a game, but it's not interactive like playable. But everything that you were just saying. So I guess what I'm saying is like the art world is full of examples of people that are already doing that. So yeah, of course, games could fall in, could do that. The idea that it's like it has to be authored by the hand of the artist is like a kind of an old fashioned idea of what art is. You know.
Hell yeah. I enjoyed this answer very much because it's a little spicy and it actually has like shown me some more art to look at. Excellent. So we've kind of come to the end of this hour. So I want to ask you what I ask everybody, which is you're a gamer. What have you played recently that has excited you or brought you some joy?
um, I I'm just gonna grab this off my desk. I've been playing some Oink games recently. I've been getting into them. Someone I don't know if you've played Town 77.
I have
Uh,
not.
this is a this is a beautiful little it's a beautiful little game. I love the graphic design of the pieces, and it's a game that is incredibly approachable. Like I've played this with family members that are not at all game players. But it's at the same time, it's like the game has a turn, and something gets very intense and strategic. So it's like extremely approachable, beautiful, and like many Oink games, awesome graphic design, lovely packaging, uh, and beautiful game design too. So this is a game that I've been playing, Town 77. I Can I also plug one more thing?
Please.
I've been working with this group of uh, were you going to ask me for plugs at the end? I don't mean to
Yeah,
jump the
no,
gun
this is
on
the
that.
time. This is plug away.
All right, plug away. Okay, I'm going to plug two things. If you're interested in like the stuff we've been talking about, using games to teach, bringing games into a classroom, or learning about game design through play and games, learning about design in general, um, the this is my most recent book, The Rules We Break, and it is basically a whole bunch of the exercises that I use to teach design through games and play. So it's games to play, to mod, how to have game design projects. So I'd recommend that. The Rules We Break. The other thing I want to mention is that I've been working with this group called the Green Games Guide. Have you heard about that initiative, Liz?
Only through stalking you on the internet. So tell us about it.
Ah, okay. Well, the Green Games Guide is uh, it's a best practices guide for sustainably designing, manufacturing, publishing, distributing tabletop games. So if you are working as a designer or a publisher, please look us up, greengamesguide.com. And that's an ongoing kind of volunteer project, but I'm really proud of the work that we're doing um, in trying to think about how to make tabletop games world more environmentally sustainable.
Fantastic. And you've mentioned something about where people can find you and your projects online, but where else, if anywhere, do you like to be found if people want to follow your work and engage with what you're doing?
Yeah, my website is ericzimmerman.com. And otherwise, I'm not that active on social media these days, but I guess if you're in the New York City area, come and visit the NYU Game Center. We have a bunch of events happening all the time. Look me up and come say hi.
Fantastic. I, of course, am everywhere. Everybody is Beyond Solitaire. I'm terminally online and easy to find. But Eric, thank you so much for coming on. This was an absolute delight, and I loved getting to talk to you about games, teaching them, making them, the whole shebang.
Yeah, Liz, it was really awesome conversation. Thank you so much.
All right, everybody out there, please like, subscribe, comments, and most of all, happy gaming.